Friends, I'd like to introduce very briefly my new book, which has just been published from Pan Macmillan, India. The book is entitled The Fury of COVID-19, The Politics, Histories, and Unrequited Love of the Coronavirus. In the 10 months since the pandemic just broke out, we have already seen a fair amount of literature emerge on the subject. But it appears to me that this book of mine, if I may say so, is a rather unusual venture into this domain of literature. Much of the literature that has been published has been done so from the scientific or medical standpoint. But this book is a work which is really on the political, social, economic, and cultural aspects of the coronavirus pandemic, as well as on its philosophical and ethical implications. Now, the first claim that I advance in this book is that the coronavirus pandemic is an event which is really unprecedented in human history. As a historian, I'm well aware of the fact that there have been many epidemics in the preceding centuries. And in fact, the 1918 influenza epidemic, which lasted for several years and is nicknamed the Spanish flu, killed 50 to 100 million people. We have to remember that the population of the world was much smaller at that time. So proportionately, it was an enormous number of people, dwarfing the number of deaths that have occurred this year thus far. But nonetheless, if I say that this is really an unprecedented event in world history, I do so because we have never before seen an event with such unprecedented levels of state intervention. And state intervention, not just in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 countries, but all over the world. For essentially 3 months from, let's say, the end of the end of March to the end of June, the world was essentially shut down. The global economy had shuttered. The ports were idle. Airplanes were no longer flying. Airports were obviously closed. Schools, universities, museums, galleries, shopping malls, everything was essentially shut down. We don't know of any incident in history where this level of state intervention led to the global shuttering of the economy. It is also the case, of course, that we are living in a time when we are in various ways connected. I say this with the full recognition that we are also gravely disconnected in various ways. But when I say connected here, I mean, of course, that there is a vast social media. There are satellite communication satellites. There's television. The likelihood that there are people in this world who don't know anything of the coronavirus is not very great. And I say this, of course, with the full recognition that there are people who may not have been impacted, perhaps, if they happen to be living in some remote parts. But nearly everyone has been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. And in that sense, too, this is an event that is really unprecedented in history. But this book is also about the response around the world to the pandemic and why the response varied so much. There are countries that have been able to successfully contain the virus. We have all heard about the success of China. China, of course, is an authoritarian state, and many countries may not wish to emulate and should not emulate, certainly, some of the draconian methods used by the Chinese. But we have also heard of the success of South Korea and Taiwan. Very few have heard of the success of Cuba and Vietnam. And Vietnam, at this point in time, with a population of 100 million, has 35 deaths. The United States, in contrast, has 250,000 deaths, with a population that is only 3 times, just a little over 3 times the population of Vietnam. And it may well be that traditions of individualism, the decentralization of authority, the suspicion of the state, which runs very deep in the United States, that all of these, in addition to, of course, the ineptness of the Trump administration, have contributed to the exceedingly sorry state of affairs that we find in the United States. Right? But this book goes beyond the question of the humbling of the United States. It goes beyond the question of how India, with its immense population and with its immense density of population, consider, for example, Dharavi, which has a density of population of something of the magnitude of 500,000 people per square kilometer, which contrasts with the density of population in New Zealand, which is a mere 15 or 20 per square kilometer. So containing the virus in a place like New Zealand is, of course, much easier than containing it in a place like Dharavi. And yet in India, they did contain the virus in Dharavi. And so the book looks at all of these aspects of the coronavirus pandemic, but I suggest as well that there are many other aspects of it that we really have to think about. And I have already indicated that one of the things that we should be thinking about is the variance in the cultural norms of a society, which may in fact actually lead to different outcomes with respect to how the coronavirus pandemic was handled. The other thing that the book touches upon is the issue of climate change. I mean, we saw in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic that pollution levels had really gone down dramatically in many parts of the world, including India, and consumption levels went down. And we know, for those of us who have been thinking about climate change, which is undoubtedly the gravest problem that lies ahead of us, we know that enhanced consumption of the last 50 years has contributed enormously to climate change. And one of the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic was that consumption levels went down. And this is, of course, what contributed to the clean air and clean waters supply, and so on. To think of the coronavirus pandemic, however, we have to bring to the fore all the resources available to us, not only by the faculty of reason, but we have to think about what poetry, art, literature can do. There are some fundamental issues that the coronavirus pandemic places before us. The whole problematic of social distancing. Most countries are in the midst of yet another pandemic. Certainly the advanced countries, as they're called, of the industrialized West, are in the midst of a pandemic of loneliness. Britain even has a minister of loneliness, right? And one of the consequences of the pandemic is that people have to now stop socializing, right? They have to stop using the public sphere, right? They have to learn to live with themselves to some degree. And we have to be able to make a distinction between such things as loneliness and solitude, because solitude can be chosen and one can live very fruitfully in solitude. But the loneliness that has come about as a consequence of the nature of modern society, which has now been aggravated by the coronavirus, is something that we haven't chosen. It has been thrust upon us. It is something that has occurred as a consequence of the kinds of social arrangements we have in modern society, right? We have been told that we shouldn't touch people, but touch is the essence of what it means to be human. The skin makes up a considerable portion of our body weight, right? To be deprived of the touch of someone, what does that mean? So this book is also an exploration of those kinds of aspects of the coronavirus. But I would like to say as well that it is possible, in fact, to think of the virus As I said, in many other veins, we can think about what, as I have mentioned before, what literature can do, what art can do, but perhaps we should also think about what cartoons can do. So here is a cartoon where a man is purchasing a roll of toilet paper uh, in the dark of the night, exchanging money for it. Because, of course, in many countries, particularly in the West, one of the biggest news items when the pandemic broke out, surprisingly enough, shockingly enough, amusingly enough, was the fact that there was an enormous shortage of toilet paper. And the whole question, this cartoon is an interesting cartoon which shows uh, 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 the hazards of uh, well, not the hazards of masking as much as some of the it hints at some of the disputes over masking that have taken place, and in particular, of course, it points to the enormous reluctance that Trump has shown towards masking. And this cartoon is an arresting commentary on some of the aspects of masking. But on a much lighter touch, we can also think about the fact that relationships between dogs and humans have, in many ways, been inverted. Dogs have free runs of the street, right? They don't have to really worry about touch. They're not carriers of the coronavirus. And so here we have a cartoon where a man extends his hand to a dog for a handshake, as people typically sometimes do, right? When they get introduced to, for the first time, to the dog of a friend, and the dog says, "You must be joking. It doesn't want to get the virus." And here is a meme where we see this inversion of this relationship between the dog and the virus. So there are different ways to think about the virus. This book is a work which is really extremely wide ranging in its sweep, not just geographically, but temporally as well, because as a historian, I have, in fact, uh, gone to the past in an attempt to understand some of the contours of our present predicament. And with this, I hope that all of you will consider getting a copy of this book and sharing your thoughts with me and with other readers. Thank you.